Young Thug, from Cleveland Avenue to courtroom drama. Before the fame, before the hits, before the RICO case, before he was truly humble under God, who is Young Thug. From Bleveland Avenue, as he would call it, on November 1st, 2024, after more than 900 days behind bars, Jeffery Williams was released from jail. Just a couple days earlier, though, he was facing a possible sentence of 120 years. The rapper, whose real name is Jeffery Williams Jr, was arrested on a Monday on 56 counts of racketeering. Indictment: he had been on trial for almost a year, with the proceedings around his fate eventually becoming the longest trial in the history of Georgia. Before that, though, he was a music legend. Young Thug had been an icon in hip-hop for over 10 years, with people calling his voice a beautiful instrument, an extraordinarily distinctive artist, with 3 Billboard #1 singles and countless awards to his name. In the words of many critics, he was the David Bowie or Prince of hip-hop, one of the biggest musical figures to ever come out of Atlanta. With a general understanding that hip-hop wouldn't be what it is today without him, his clothes have ended up in fine art exhibits around the world, and he even won a Grammy Award for Song of the Year in 2019. But the story of how he ended up in a courtroom facing a 120-year sentence in the first place as part of the longest and most controversial trial ever in Georgia is long and complicated. It's an all-too-real reminder of a corrupt legal system, the dark side of the music industry, and of course, the life of Young Thug himself. And it all starts with a little kid growing up in one of the worst parts of Atlanta, known as the city in the forest. With 48% of the city being covered in trees, it results in a reputation for beautiful, affluent neighborhoods with mansions and parks. But on the other side of the coin, its most dangerous areas can often be described as dark and scary, thanks to winding streets and secluded tree-covered neighborhoods. In Atlanta, you might not know you're on the wrong side of town until it's too late. And one little island in Atlanta that's a sea of trees was Jonesboro South, a housing project that existed from 1970 till it was demolished in 2008, providing government-funded housing for up to 150 low-income families. At a time, it was widely known as one of the worst places to live in Georgia, with everyday life being consumed and overrun with crime, addiction, and violence. Conditions got bad enough that in the end, it was easier for the government to tear the whole thing down and give everyone somewhere else to live, rather than try and clean it up. Add on top of that, Atlanta has a reputation for entire parts of the city being heavily affected by poverty, urban decay, and little to no economic opportunities for the residents. The result is hundreds of thousands of people for whom making it out has literal effect. One of those people was Jeffery Williams. Born in the summer of 1991, he was the 10th of 11 children in his family. Speaking years later, he said this about his experiences growing up.
I want you to see anything you see wrong with me came from the projects.
Jonesboro South along his right cheekbone was a thin but prominent scar. Jonesboro, he repeats, shaking his head. You know how roaches look in rats, right? He later said, I was in the streets at 8 years old. I went to school so my mom and dad would keep buying me clothes. But when I got out, I did whatever I wanted to.
I want you to see anything you see wrong with me came from the projects.
Fighting or all other kinds of scar, but the part of the story where this kid from one of the worst areas in Atlanta, who was living a hard, dangerous life from a young age, got on the path to become an internationally known artist, wasn't a big, profound moment of artistic inspiration. Young Thug said it himself. Anyone can rap if you've got brains. So I just went with it. For a lot of people around him, making music represented a way to get ahead, a way to make a name for yourself, a way to make it out.
During an interview from 2014 when he was 20 years old and had just started to attract some hype in the industry, he talked about sleeping at the studio and the motivations that drove his early musical output.
Thug explains that he crashed at the studio as he often does. I never leave, he says in a fixated draw.
All day, every second. Gotta keep the money coming in. There's another largely forgotten look into his early work and mindset that you can find online in a Reddit post from 2010. A 19-year-old Young Thug posted an AMA interview, and it showed that his mindset was a lot sharper than most people who stumbled upon him would have assumed. Out of all 6 questions he received, the most interesting one was this.
Within 30 seconds of you rapping, how often do you mention clubs, expensive cars, and booze?
His answer was, I make a product for a certain audience, and I'm good at it. Supply and demand. Simple economics. I don't do this because I love the attention. I do this because I have a certain skill set that allows me to get paid without the threat of doing federal time. Basically, for Young Thug and many people around him coming from Jonesboro South and places like it, opportunities to make real money were few and far between. It made sense to him to either make a name for himself as an artist or risk jail time for his crimes. But it wouldn't be long before Young Thug started to stand out and went down a much different road than his early motivations of getting money. Seemed to imply that he was looking for Young Thug made an incredible amount of music in the early 2010s, putting out 10 mixtapes between 2011 and 2014. The first 3, a series called I Came From. Nothing were just pure Dirty South mixtapes. A DJ yelling over the slow, sludgy beats, laid-back flows, mid-D instruments. Young Thug's first ever mixtape featured artists like Future, at a time when the song Tony Montana had only come out a few weeks earlier. For the most part, there was a whole lot of Thug rapping like he's doing his best Lil Wayne impression, with corny yet funny lyrics and one of the thickest Atlanta accents you'll like ever. By the time 2015 rolled around, he had ascended to a level entirely his own. Crazy inflections, one of the most unique vocal styles you'll ever hear, bizarre onliners, and a voice that sounds more like a broken instrument than anything else. He was a rapper making hip-hop for sure, but the focus was always more on his ability to make music with his voice, than anything he actually said with lyrics. Track 9 from his 2015 mixtape Slime Season perfectly encapsulates what I'm saying. It's definitely a rap song, but when you listen to it, you don't hear much of what he's rapping. Instead, you listen to him floating on the beat with beautiful melodies unlike anything you've ever heard before. Talent for creating catchy, unforgettable hooks and flows, even just a few years into his journey, was literally unmatched. But even though he was coming from some of the roughest streets in America, the big thing that made Young Thug stand out was that he was just really fucking weird. Young Thug's early hits like Lifestyle, Best Friend Ma'am, and more made a name for him mainly because he was just so strange. Whoever he was rapping alongside, featuring on their song, he made them sound boring and normal. It didn't matter who it was, he always stole the show. But depending on who you asked, that wasn't always a good thing. People online would say he mumbled too much or didn't have any good verses, while songs like Best Friend and Lifestyle were big hits. In a lot of ways, it was because of the shock factor. Underneath all of that, though, was the clear, obvious reality that this guy was something different. Him being difficult to understand wasn't because he was from Atlanta. It was because he was from an entirely different planet, making music that didn't sound like anything else that existed at the time. A lot of the songs he made 10 years ago still sound fresh today. But despite some critics labeling him as untalented or weird or just plain bad, Young Thug's energy was unstoppable. Fast forward a few years, and he had become the definition of an icon. Massive hits like Pick Up the Phone, Hot Sacrifices, and his unique style of melodic rapping even made its way into mainstream pop radio when he featured on the absolutely massive Diamond Certified Havana by Camila Cabello in 2018. Plus a seemingly endless list of his own mixtapes, albums, and songs that all painted a picture of Young Thug as more than just someone with a weird style, but instead an innovative artist. When he released his album Jeffery in 2016, he wore a dress by the Italian designer Alessandro Trinone on the album cover, a dress that became so famous it ended up touring art museums all around the world for its place in music history, while at the same time attracting mountains of negative attention from hip-hop media. When talking about himself, he would say he was the next Michael Jackson, and he quickly became famous for hardly ever writing lyrics, instead coming up with almost every single one of his lyrics in real time to facilitate the massive amount of music he put out over the years. And without Young Thug, hip-hop wouldn't be what it is now. helping launch the careers of chart-topping rappers like Gunna, Lil Baby, Playboi Carti, and more. He changed the game in a big way, helping spread his unique sound around the world. Eventually, he even became a fixture in the high art, high-fashioned world, consulting at runway shows in London, Milan, and more. Most people growing up in the environment that Young Thug did couldn't even dream of making it as far as he did. Living through what he lived through as a kid leaves scars on even the most creative, intelligent, or hardworking people, if you're even able to physically get out in the first place. Young Thug's own family was forever changed by their circumstances. When he was a child, he often told stories about his older brother Benny getting killed in front of their house when Thug was 8, or his other brother, who was serving life in prison. From a 2014 interview, Thug's phrase, "I came from nothing," which he uses as a mantra, is a tribute to Jonesboro South, which no longer exists. "There's nothing there now," he says, "just grass." Thug says his family stayed till the last day, until they started knocking down buildings a year later. Atlanta's housing director went on record and said, "We've realized that concentrating families in poverty is very destructive." Although it wasn't something he often shared in his music or interviews, when he did talk about it, he would describe his childhood as hellish. During an interview with Young Thug and a friend from Jonesboro South named Wicked, the journalist wrote, "I asked him what his father did for a living, and he puts one hand over his face, under his eyes, like a mask, and makes a gun with the other. There were 11 of us," he says, "so it was worse than struggle. That shit was hell." His dad and Wicked's uncle had been best friends and used to do shit they can't even talk. His dad once served 2 years in prison on a mistaken identity charge for something Wicked's uncle had done. Wicked says Thug was really different growing up, and that he already had the vision for his part. Thug says he idolized older kids like Pee Wee Longway and Wicked, who had money, weed, and girls, and so he got into petty theft and gambling and on. One thing led to another. His manager in 2014 said that he tries to keep him busy recording or performing because when he isn't making music, he can be a problem. Despite him being an open-minded, unique, and creative figure in the Atlanta music scene, he didn't leave behind the connections and identity that created him or the people who had been by his side the whole time. And Thug's manager's fears were ultimately correct. Even as he started his own family, built up his music empire, branched out into other ventures, Young Thug was followed by legal issues. Since the early days of his career in 2015, he was sued by Young Money Records after Lil Wayne's tour bus was fired at by members of a gang that he was associated with. He had his houses in Georgia raided multiple times over the years, resulting in felony gun and drug possession charges. But no one expected that on May 9th, 2022, just a few months after he released 2 #1 albums in a year, Young Thug would be arrested at his home in Buckhead, one of Atlanta's most affluent areas, where he owned a 10,000-foot mansion worth almost $3 million. Alongside him, Nana and 28 other men associated with Young Thug's YSL label were taken into custody. The news was shocking. Young Thug was bigger than ever, with his music reaching new heights with each release as he quickly became one of the most respected rappers alive. YSL, Young Thug's label, having represented artists like NBA Youngboy, Lil Baby, Gunna, and more, over the years was accused by the Fulton County District Attorney of being not just a record label, but also a mafia. With a long list of crimes being attributed to them, Young Thug was, in their words, the leader. But the question arose, who was bold enough to bring these massive charges against one of hip-hop's most influential figures? That person was Fani Willis. Fani Willis is an ambitious and highly skilled lawyer, growing up in Inglewood, California with a complex history of her own, her father having been a founder of the Black Panthers in the 1960s. After going to law school and moving to Atlanta to be a lawyer, she quickly made her mark by exposing that 44 out of 56 schools in Atlanta were falsifying test results on standardized tests. But her ambition didn't stop there. Willis also took on Donald Trump, filing highly controversial election racketeering charges after the 2020 election, which led to her securing his now infamous mugshot at the same FTO County Jail where Young Thug was being held at the same time. And YSL wasn't the first target Willis had when it came to dismantling gang activity in Atlanta. Before Young Thug, she went after Drug Rich Gang, a crew associated with Rich Homie Quan, a former friend of Young Thug. And not long after the charges against Thug were filed, a leak list appeared. revealing that other potential targets she was looking at included groups affiliated with Playboi Carti, Future, Lil Baby, and more. The case against Young Thug was simple. In January of 2015, 26-year-old Donovan Nut Thomas was gunned down outside Atlanta barbershop in what authorities described as a premeditated attack. According to prosecutors, the murder was not a random act of violence, but a calculated hit connected to ongoing rivalries in the city. And the Fulton County District Attorney's Office alleges that Young Thug had a central role in orchestrating the killing. Prosecutors claim that Young Thug financed and organized the hit, tying it to a larger racketeering scheme under Georgia's RICO Act. A key piece of evidence presented early in the case involves a silver Infiniti Q50 sedan, reportedly rented in Young Thug's name, which, prosecutors say, was the getaway vehicle in the murder. Surveillance footage from the night of the murder captured the car near the crime scene, further linking Young Thug to the incident. According to the state's allegations, and immediately mentally out of the gate, Fani Willis established a strategy of bringing rap lyrics and social media posts as a mountain of evidence in her case against Young Thug. A highly controversial move that, while widely considered unconstitutional,
doesn't have any previously set precedent for or against it at this time.
It was shocking and controversial. Unfortunately for Thug, he would be denied bond over and over, with the state describing him as a significant risk to his community. He remained behind bars with no chance of release or bail, as the process of jury selection and setting up a trial got underway. But with over 30 years of legal experience, Young Thug's attorney, Brian Steele, wasn't going down without a fight. He was bringing in unmatched expertise and determination to win a highly intimidating case, protecting one of the most pivotal figures in modern hip-hop, despite the DA's overwhelming desire to put him behind bars for the rest of his life. The YSL trial was unprecedented in its scope and complexity. It's difficult to understand just how big it really was. It stands now as the longest trial in Georgia's history, with jury selection alone taking over 10 months and requiring more than 1,000 Georgia residents to be called before they found the final 12 jurors. 4 different judges presided over the case after 3 were recused, and the prosecution would call more than 300 witnesses. Amid the proceedings, 3 co-defendants were stabbed while in jail. The real story, though, is about how this case was handled on all sides, becoming not just the longest trial in Georgia's history, but by far one of the most absurd legal proceedings ever seen. Even though Young Thug was arrested on May 9, 2022, jury selection didn't begin until January of 2023, 8 months later. By the time that process got underway, Young Thug had already spent months behind bars waiting for his day in court. The process of jury selection itself, though, was grueling and difficult, taking over 10 months as both the prosecution and defense searched long and hard to find 12 impartial individuals from the massive pool in front of them. According to a legal expert, there are a few reasons why this process is unusually challenging. Number 1, he's a celebrity. And number 2, it's a RICO trial. They're estimating it's going to take up to a year, so you have to find people who can give up a year of their life to sit on the jury, and that's really hard to do. Add on to that, the fact that jurors would only be paid $25 a day to be on the case. It was probably just as hard to find someone who could afford that versus someone who didn't know who Young Thug was already. As the selection process began, there were quickly issues with many jurors having conflicts of interest. Ultimately, Judge Glenville, who was presiding over the situation, made the final decision of who could sit on the jury. For this reason, to ensure each juror was vetted correctly, they had to fill out a 37-page survey, asking everything from people's social media activity to their frequency of listening to rap music, to make sure they wouldn't be biased for or against Young Thug. A difficult situation to be in, given his status as one of the most famous musicians in Atlanta. Of course, though, there were even more hiccups that only further delayed the trial from getting underway. Glenville ended up punishing a number of people who had been summoned to be on the jury, including one person who had gone on a trip to the Dominican Republic instead of reporting for duty, while that person was forced to write a 30-page essay on the importance of civic responsibility. Another juror was held in contempt for speaking with a reporter from the Atlanta Journal. Not only was communicating with the media completely prohibited, but so was consuming outside information about the case. That person in particular ended up getting sentenced to 20 days in jail, although their sentence was reduced to community service at a school or church, focusing on choices and consequences. Speaking on it, in retrospect, one person from the final jury said that 5 members of the jury experienced some type of death in their family during the trial that they had to push down and keep going to work through due to the demands of being in court. As here got started, though, things didn't calm down. Another particularly bizarre incident unfolded in the courtroom not long after when Young Thug's co-defendant, Adams, passed him a pill in plain view of everyone during a pre-trial hearing. When security footage revealed that Adams had handed Thug a parrot, prosecution jumped on the incident as evidence of misconduct, but their attempt to use it against Thug ultimately failed. Brian Steele maintained that his client didn't even know Mr. Adams or know what he was handing him, and the court declined to take any action against Thug, clearing him of wrongdoing. But the situation took a dramatic turn when Adams was rushed to the hospital after swallowing all the remaining contraband he had on him. This bizarre episode is just one example of how surreal and chaotic the YSL trial had been from start to finish. The sheer audacity of someone attempting to pass drugs to the trial's primary defendant, one already facing numerous drug-related charges during a publicly televised live stream hearing, is almost unbelievable.
Hospitals. The other thing I would just invite counsel to talk with their clients about, I know I've mentioned this 3 times now, what is considered to be acceptable behavior. This is the 3rd time that we've had contraband introduced into this into this space. The court's concern is that this may pose issues to them remaining and being present in this space.
Another incident came when a Zoom call intended for lawyers to organize their cases and monitor proceedings remotely was shockingly hijacked, with intruders playing pornographic content on the screens. One of the most notable and much more serious moments, though, came when Judge Glenville granted that lyrics could be brought as evidence by prosecutors against Brian Steele's arguments, which stated that his client's lyrics were artistic expression. Judge Glenville ruled that the lyrics were further confirmation of the claims made by prosecution. He didn't believe it attacked free speech and allowed it for the trial. Using any kind of song lyrics as evidence in court has long been a controversial move, although the U.S. Supreme Court did establish that it's unconstitutional to use protected speech in court, like music lyrics. There is no conclusive legal precedent on the issue. In the past, artists like Snoop Dogg have run into similar issues where their artistic persona and real personality gets conflated by prosecutors. There's even a book called Rap on Trial that tells the history of over 500 hip-hop artists who have had their lyrics used against them over the years. In general, though, many legal experts describe it as a questionable practice because, as put by the Columbia Journal of Law, as artists, rap music lyricists are similar to fiction writers. Rap lyrics consist of constructed images, metaphor, raga doho, or exaggerated storylines. Thus, lyrics often don't constitute a confession to an actual crime. And so the way that these prosecutors wanted to bring lyrics into the case was a classic example of the legal system being biased against certain groups of people or types of expression, something that it seems like shouldn't be allowed. But still, Fulton County prosecutors seemed convinced they could connect the dots anyway, and the maximum sentence Young Thug was facing was a genuinely intimidating 120 years. Still, though, things would only get even crazier as the case proceedings continued, soon coming to an unexpected head when the prosecutors brought their star witness to the stand to get the trial moving once and for all. Kenneth Copeland, also known as YSL Woody, emerged as a crucial prosecution witness in the YSL trial, a rapper from Atlanta with a troubled past. Woody's legal problems began years earlier when he left a rifle unattended on gym bleachers during a pickup basketball game, endangering over 20 people, including children. After receiving a federal prison sentence for this incident, he was later caught with another firearm during a routine traffic stop, facing up to 10 years behind bars. He struck a deal with authorities, agreeing to become an informant in exchange for immunity on his own charges. As part of the process, Woody participated in a 3-hour interrogation where he provided extensive incriminating information about Young Thug, with a lot of the information, what he gave, becoming a foundational part of the prosecution's case against YSL. But all of this changed suddenly and dramatically when he took the stand. Previously, having been known for his willingness to snitch to avoid prison, he now grew visibly anxious when sitting on the stand. The pressure was so overwhelming that he invoked the Fifth Amendment right from the start, refusing to answer the very first question, which was just about his age. His sudden refusal to communicate resulted in him being held in contempt of court, in spending the following weekend in Fulton County Jail.
Strangely, though, just a few days later, when he returned to the courtroom, now sitting on the witness stand in handcuffs, he was suddenly able to testify without a problem. But Young Thug's defense attorney Brian Steele wasted no time pointing out the suspicious circumstances surrounding Woody's change of heart, the highlight of which was that Steele was aware of a private meeting that had taken place just days earlier between the judge, Woody, his attorney, and the prosecution, before court proceedings began. Steele claimed that something shady had occurred during this meeting, implying that Woody may have been coerced or intimidated into testifying against his will. He asserted that not only was Woody possibly being pressured into providing testimony, but that he might also be under pressure to say exactly what the prosecutors wanted him to say.
Instead of saying what he truly believed. The abrupt shift in Woody's willingness to cooperate only deepened the suspicion around the prosecution's tactics in this trial. But they also stopped the entire thing dead in its tracks.
I don't care. I don't care. I give over everything. I've done this for 33 years. Never in my life have I.
I've done 300 appeals in the state of Georgia alone. I've never read a case like this.
For anyone unfamiliar, an EXP party meeting is a private discussion between a judge and one side of a court case without the other side's involvement. These type of meetings, especially involving a sworn witness, raise serious ethical and legal concerns. And given that the nature of these meetings contradicts the right to due process given by the Constitution, they're also illegal. And Brian Steele had just exposed that the state of Georgia had organized one against his client. Emphasizing that the judge had allowed the defense to be kept in the dark, Brian Steele demanded answers from Judge Glenville, only for the judge's response not to be addressing the meeting's legality, but instead demanding that Steele reveal who told him about it. But Steele refused, doubling down on his assertion that the media was a blatant attempt to coerce YSL, Woody into testifying against Young Thug and the rest of the record label. Judge Glenville, though, focused solely on how the information had leaked, deflecting the accusations and escalating the confrontation to a whole other level.
If you don't tell me who it is, I'm going to put you in contempt, because that is not attorney-client privilege, attorney work product privilege. I am not. How did you get that information?
Supposedly from my chambers, somebody tell you, you should have told me you got 5 minutes. Well, I don't need it. I want to continue in minutes. This is what I was told. Mr. Cop made statements.
The tension reached a boiling point when Steele stood his ground, refusing to disclose his source. This led to the judge holding him in contempt of court, legal penalty often described as a timeout for disrupting proceedings.
Brian Steele was then sentenced to 10 weekends in Fulton County Jail. But in a move that showed an extraordinary level of commitment to his client, Brian Steele requested that he could be sent to the same jail cell as Young Thug so they could continue strategizing during his sentence. Although he ended up being allowed to bond out before actually getting booked,
Take Mr. Steele into custody, please.
Still, though, the fact that Judge Glenville held a meeting with Georgia prosecutors and a witness without the defense presence isn't just unethical, it was a glaring side of bias towards the prosecution side. What's more, though, when confronted, the judge never denied that the meeting took place.
Instead, he focused solely on the leak, sidestepping the actual issue. His evasiveness, combined with his aggressive pushback against Steele, would ultimately bring about his recusal from the trial entirely. Because in a pivotal motion for the trial and the future of everyone involved, Another one of YSL's defense attorneys, Doug Weinstein, accused Judge Glenville of bias and requested for him to be removed from the trial entirely.
His heavy-handed and secretive approach towards YSL, Woody, and refusal to discuss it with defense attorneys raised alarming questions about judicial overreach and cast doubt on the trial's integrity as a whole. Because when the transcript of the meeting was finally unsealed, Brian Steele described it as that Judge Glenville had morphed into a part of the prosecution team. As part of the request, Weinstein called for the trial to be paused until another judge could review the allegations, raising major concerns about the fairness of the proceedings. The motion was passed, and Glenville was removed, hopefully allowing a fairer and more equitable trial to move forward. Still, though, things were somehow about to get even more complicated than they had been before. After Judge Glenville was recused, another judge, Rich Krause, was assigned to review the recusal motion. However, this move only posed more conflict of interest, since Glenville and Krause were longtime colleagues, with Glenville having donated thousands of dollars to her campaigns just a few months prior. So instead, a new judge, Shakura Ingram, was appointed just 2 days later.
Though she also recused herself when it was revealed that one of her courtroom deputies, an assistant to the judge, was engaged in an intimate relationship with one of the YSL defendants.
With this leading to the deputy's arrest, Ingram felt it was no longer appropriate for her to preside over the case and left the court entirely.
From Fox News, the relationship was discovered after Fulton deputies seized the laptop belonging to Eppinger's attorney Eric Johnson, because Eppinger, the defendant, was allegedly using it to communicate with other YSL members who were not in custody.
2 days later, Stanley, the deputy, was arrested for allegedly using a phone to communicate with Eppinger inside and outside of the courtroom. The deputy also allegedly visited Eppinger in his jail cell and attempted to smuggle contraband into the jail for him.
The order of USL states that although Judge Ingram does not believe the situation creates any actual bias to the case, she views it as one that could cause a reasonable person to question the court's impartiality. And so Judge Ingram recused herself from the case to maintain public confidence in the justice system.
After so much corruption, interruption, conflict of interest, in just plain mess, the hope now was that a new judge could resolve the issues and help the trial reach its natural conclusion within a reasonable time frame. In reality, though, there were still many months to go before young Thug, his friends, colleague, and lawyers could even hope to go home to their families and be done with all of it. After Judge Ingram stepped away from the case after just 2 days in July of 2024, Judge Paige Whitaker was able to fully take over the case. Coming with a reputation for quickly churning through cases, confidence was high that she could get the trial back on track. Still, though, the case had now gone on for over 9 months, and tensions and frustrations were rising quickly. After so much drama already, Judge Whitaker immediately addressed the credibility issue surrounding the testimony from Woody that had been such a huge bump in the road for the state's case. She instructed the jury that anything he had ever said previously in court would be struck down, and he would have to come back again to fully clear the possibility of coercion influencing his statements at all. But when it came time for Woody to tell his story and reveal whether or not the prosecutors could safely put so much weight on his words, Woody claimed, "I don't recall," to over 200 questions, providing little to no clarity to the situation, instead sending the case into a tailspin.
He went on record and said that anything he told police in 2015 was a lie to protect himself, casting immense doubt on his long-standing history as a snitch.
He even admitted that the killing of Donovan Thomas, the main event this case was built on to begin with, had nothing to do with YSL at all, but was instead the result of a personal beef. He openly admitted that he only blamed Young Thug for the killing of Donovan Thomas because he knew Young Thug didn't do it. He explained that he was trying to put the blame off of himself and onto someone who was clearly innocent, creating a dead end for anyone following his lead. And it only got worse from there. After saying that one of the detectives he had apparently snitched to had a brain the size of a squirrel, he was labeled a hostile witness by the prosecutors and judge, aka a witness who becomes actively unhelpful and detrimental to the party that brought them to the stand in the first place. In the wake of his testimony, prosecutors were left struggling to present a coherent case. Much of their case against Young Thug had been built on what Woody told them, and with him revealing that he had no intention of ever helping in a coherent way, they were left scrambling. Even Judge Whitaker scolded the prosecution for their disorganized presentation of evidence and their inability to provide clear arguments. After Woody, either out of some hidden genius or sheer luck, threw a huge wrench in their case against Thug. After Woody left the stand, the prosecution began an attempt to use lyrics and social media posts as evidence to support their claims that YSL was a gang. However, this approach ended up being a contradictory argument. If YSL was only making music to cover up what they were really doing, it didn't exactly make sense to try and connect the music to real events. This was only compounded by the fact that they weren't actually able to connect any lyrics to any specific crimes at all, but instead were attempting to make Thug look like a bad person in front of the jury. It was around this point that it seemed like the state's previously massive case against YSL was starting to fall apart. A number of mishaps were making them look profoundly disorganized and unprepared. From the seemingly pointless presentation where they accused a defendant of participating in animal sacrifices, to one detective admitting on record that they were missing key evidence that could prove their points if they had it, to a series of poorly organized presentations of ballistics evidence and phone records that made almost no sense at all. It was starting to look more and more like they may have never had a great plan on how to prove their charges to begin with. The state's case was further weakened as even more witnesses who were supposed to support their claims ended up undermining them instead. For example, one witness they brought up challenged the prosecution's interpretation around slaying and clothes as key evidence. When questioned about terms like slime and slat being connected to YSL as an organized gang, he explained that these terms were simply common slang words used all around the world, not gang-specific language. The defense reinforced this point by showing a number of videos of athletes and celebrities using similar words in the same way. When the prosecution attempted to use YSL-branded merch as evidence of gang activity, it fell flat again.
These items had been widely sold to the general public, holding no inherent criminal connection at all. And it was understood by everyone that was the case at this point in time, with the case being well over 10 months long. Even the judge was getting impatient at the prosecutor seemingly turning the trial into a circus. On September 30th, 2024, Judge Whitaker even reprimanded one of the prosecuting attorneys, saying that she was purposefully hiding the ball to the biggest extent she possibly could for as long as she possibly could, looking so unorganized that it seemed like she was throwing the case together as it went along. But it is baffling to me that somebody with the number of years of experience that you have, time after time after time, continues to seemingly purposefully hide the ball to the extent you possibly can for as long as you possibly can. And I really don't want to believe that it is purposeful, but honestly, after a certain number of times, you start to wonder how it could be anything but that. Unless it is just that you are so unorganized that you are throwing this together as you try it for the past 2 years. The narrative had been that Young Thug would probably never go home again, or at least not until he was 50, 60 years old or older. Most people who saw a RICO charge brought on by the state of Georgia immediately knew what that meant. He was cooked. But as time went on, it became clear that the state of Georgia didn't have much evidence on him at all, and instead were coming up with arguments and evidence as they went. Young Thug was an easy target, or at least he should have been. But instead of the state's attorneys being able to pat themselves on the back and make a show out of dismantling gangs, they taking down rappers and celebrities, they instead ended up wasting a massive amount of money and time on all sides, with no clear end goal. Ultimately, they had little to zero evidence of their RAPL claim, and by the end of 2024, almost every co-defendant was able to take a plea deal and go home, or have their sentences reduced. By the end of October, Young Thug himself was one of the only co-defendants left standing, as it became the longest trial in the history of Georgia. And then, suddenly, on October 31st, 2024, Young Thug went home after 900 days in custody, in a sudden and unprecedented end to the story. Even still, though, the way he got out and the way it almost didn't happen is yet another wild chapter in the story. Despite years of court, the circumstances surrounding Young Thug's sudden release still came down to the last second in many ways again, due to a lack of competence on the part of prosecutors. As the trial was about to get into its second year, in late October, it had gotten to a point where Judge Whitaker suggested that the prosecution and defense get together and discuss what a plea deal could look like to avoid a mistrial. Following yet another map,
where the prosecution accidentally revealed classified information to the jury when it was supposed to be redacted while on the stand, state witness W. Lee, a rapper known as Slime Life Shy, was asked by the prosecution to review social media posts in front of the jury, but Lee was inadvertently given an unredacted version of a post that referred to the hashtag #FreeQUA, which could have applied to 2 co-defendants on the case. That prosecutorial misstep was major enough that Whitaker suggested she would consider a mistrial motion. With a chance of a mistrial, starting the whole process all over again, wasting massive amounts of time and money, the judge's words put a ton of pressure on both sides to figure out a plea deal that could resolve the entire situation without having to start over again. Negotiations for a plea deal took days, with the defense asking for Thug to go home immediately on house arrest, while prosecutors advocated for him to get 45 years in prison. But it all came to a head when the judge called out that the prosecutors had previously been willing to let him out immediately if he testified against his co-defendants, begging the question of whether or not they actually saw him as a threat or if they were just trying to make an example out of him, as Judge Ree Whitaker noted in her closing remarks. The prosecution's initial offer of probation, which they then took back, seemingly conceded that they didn't think Young Thug was the danger to the community they had initially framed him as. While some of the people around Thug had allegedly committed violent crimes, the prosecutors didn't seem to have much to tie Thug to them, besides text records, rap lyrics, and social media posts that they hoped would collectively paint a menacing portrait. Ultimately, Young Thug agreed to a blind plea instead of trying to negotiate with prosecutors who seemed to be clearly acting in bad faith. He put his fate in the hands of Judge Whitaker, and that move paid off. Later that day, the judge sentenced him to 15 years probation with no time served in prison, allowing him to go home. Later the same day,
she said, "I know you're talented, and if you choose to continue to rap, you need to try to use your influence to let kids know that this is not the way to go and that there are ways out of poverty besides hooking up with a powerful guy at the end of the street selling drugs."
Whitaker said, "And there better be no violations, but if there are any, you're coming back to see me." After speaking with the judge, talking about his own accountability, his own upbringing, and how his choices affect others, 2 years of corruption, disorganization, and jail time finally came to an end.
Really, everybody that got something to do with this situation, I want to say sorry for just like, having so much time investing into this, and I'm older, I'm
or maybe go home in 3 months completely free. But in the end, yet his team made the call that seemed right to them at the moment. The challenge now is with strict conditions imposed by the court that he must fulfill during this period. For one, for the first 10 years of his probation, he's completely banned from entering Metro Atlanta, where his entire family and community is from. There are a few exceptions for the sake of respect and dignity. He can visit Atlanta for family events like weddings, funerals, or graduations, or to address any serious illness of an immediate family member. But for these occasions, it's defined that he's allowed to arrive 24 hours before and must leave within 48 hours of any event he's attending.
But Young Thug is from Atlanta. His music and brand is based on that fact. Not to mention, that's where his family and businesses being restricted from living in or even visiting his hometown has major implications for his career in life. Another, more standard requirement from his probation is that he's expected to perform community service. The court has arranged for Young Thug to come to Atlanta on a supervised visit 4 times each year to deliver anti-gang, anti-gun violence presentations at local schools. He has to do this for at least 100 hours every year for 15 years. But the last 2 stipulations of Young Thug's probation seem significantly more challenging and could easily make it difficult for him to successfully complete the entire term. First of all, the court has prohibited him from knowingly interacting with anyone who's involved in a criminal street gang, as well as any individuals that were included in his indictment. There are only 2 exceptions: his brother, who's currently serving a 9-year prison sentence following the trial, and Gunna, who, according to Young Thug, he needs to communicate with due to contractual commitments. In addition, he's completely barred from promoting any kind of gang activity. This includes using hand signs associated with gang affiliation. It also includes references in the lyrics of his songs. And considering that his record label is now labeled as a gang, that means he has to heavily control the contents of his songs to stay out of prison. Of course, looking back now, it's frustrating to hear any of this when the state was originally willing to let all of this go if he would testify against his co-defendants. And that kind of sums it up as a whole.
Ultimately, the state of Georgia built up a case against Young Thug and YSL without a lot of, or really any, concrete evidence to show what they had done wrong. Whether or not they knew this going in is a pivotal, yet difficult to confirm question. Either way, though, the lack of integrity combined with how much power they were wielding is terrifying, to say the least. Being able to intimidate witnesses, keep people in jail for years without trial, it paints a picture of an abuse of authority, to put it lightly.
In some ways, it's possible to even interpret this as if Fulton County prosecutors themselves were acting like a gang on their own. Even some prominent Atlanta lawyers criticized the DA's office for the way they went after YSL, saying things like they didn't have the discipline to tell a coherent story and focus too much on irrelevant evidence. Speaking anonymously, one of the case's jurors said that the state's case felt like a torn-up picture they tried to tape back together. Still though, the trial was a warning shot to the hip-hop community as a whole. DA Fannie Willis set a monumental precedent for using rap lyrics as evidence in trials, citing multiple songs against YSL as proof of crimes they had committed, saying that if you decide to admit crimes over a beat, I'm going to use it. Before the trial, she put a huge weight on that tactic, but it ultimately backfired when the jury wasn't convinced at all.
Even if they have nothing real on you, they can lock you up for years and waste your time and your family's time for as long as they want. While ultimately their strategy failed with jurors and judges recognizing that rappers have a right to make songs without it being used against them for unrelated crimes.
It's still not out of the question for them to do it again to someone else, or inspire other artists to change the way they express themselves to avoid having the spotlight put on them. Rappers like Lil Baby, Playboi Carti, Lil Durk, and many others have all made moves to distance themselves from their gang-affiliated past in the last few years. But even Lil Durk wasn't able to outrun the law and got booked on federal murder-for-hire charges just a few days before Young Thug was released. With artists not wanting to get booked for years on illegitimate, unrelated charges, it seems like certain topics will be off-limits for the time being, at least until a higher court makes a decision one way or the other on what sort of speech is actually protected under the First Amendment or not. This time, the right side seems to have won, but with the grave cause of taking years off the life of everyone involved. If you made it this far, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so we can provide more documentaries like this. We are on the roll to 100 subscribers. If you don't subscribe, you are a hater, and I know you don't want to be a hater. See you next time here at Top 5, Dead or Alive.